So now we're going to talk to an expert about what all of this means. Joining me now, former CIA officer and candidate for the United States Senate, Sam Faddis. Sam, thanks for coming on the show.
Great to be here, Liz. Thank you very much.
All right, Sam, this is quite a story, and I want to start just with half of my question. The first half of this is if the Obama administration knew about the corruption, these bribery plots, extortion coming from the Russians, and they did. Both the FBI under President Obama and the Department of Justice knew, as we learned from these documents that were recently released. How could they and why would they continue to approve the sale of such a large chunk, 20% of the uranium in the United States?
Well, I mean, the short answer is there's no good reason, right? I mean, this stinks of corruption and collusion, and if you're an American of whatever political persuasion and you care about the integrity of this country, you ought to be terrified at the implications, because we sold critical assets and ignored the fact that the Russians were involved in all sorts of nefarious activities. And then the FBI, in effect, sat on this for years, sat on this. All of this, of course, occurring against the backdrop of the fact that there are these continuing allegations, unsubstantiated, that the problem here is somehow Trump and the Russians. And in fact, there are millions and millions of dollars from Russia connected directly to the Clintons.
Right. And I mean, there's so many points about this story that need to be made. I hardly know where to start. But first of all, I want to make one thing very clear. The FBI knew, they were fully aware. And in these documents, there is proof that they were aware that high-level Russian officials had a plot to infiltrate U.S. nuclear entities. They were fully aware. This was a coordinated effort by the Russians to get access to our nuclear assets, to use the word that you use. Second of all, so this is not naivete on the part of the Obama administration that it might be some other actor that was simply associated with the Russians. This was planned and plotted by the Russian government. Second of all, that brings us to, I guess, the part, that timeline that you're talking about. From 2009, that's when the FBI first learned about this. 2010, that's when the Department of Justice first learned about this. The investigation continued for the next 4 years before we found out anything about it. I mean, we're only recently learning about it, but for the next 4 years, this investigation was underway, and during that time was when the Obama administration's State Department approved the sale of that uranium. Why would they keep this secret for so long from the public? Why wouldn't they even tell Congress?
Again, there's no good reason. I mean, typically the FBI, with an investigation like this, there's going to be a race for them to call a press conference and take credit for it, and you're going to read it on the front page of every newspaper. Well, obviously, there was a presidential election underway. I mean, we went through an election, and Hillary Clinton was a candidate, and she's directly tied to all of this. Back to one of the first points you threw out, it's not just that the FBI had evidence, because they obviously did, I mean, concrete evidence. They had confidential informers. They pursued and obtained indictments, and they put people in prison as a result of this investigation. This is all hard fact that was then, as far as I can tell, covered up. And one other point worth mentioning, the guy running the FBI during this whole time frame is the same guy who now is supposedly conducting an impartial investigation of Donald Trump and his alleged ties to Russia.
Right, Robert Mueller. He was head of the FBI during this time. It's almost chilling to think about that. All right, so the other aspect of this, and perhaps this is where the politics really come to the surface here. President Obama was president at the time, Democrat. His Secretary of State was Hillary Clinton, as we know. During this time, there are eyewitness accounts and documentation, both, all you need for proof here, that say that these same Russian nuclear officials who plotted and planned with the Russian government to infiltrate U.S. nuclear entities, they sent millions and millions of dollars to the Clinton Foundation.
Yeah, vast sums. I've seen numbers as high as something like $145 million. They handed $500,000 directly to Bill Clinton under the pretext that he gave a single speech in Moscow. Back to this comparison to these specious allegations against Donald Trump, which have no substance and nobody can even define what they are. This is concrete evidence, stacks of evidence of conspiracy, criminal activity, buying influence, penetrating U.S. strategic resources, effectively ignored and shoved under the rug for years.
Right, and the crime here, and this is even taking the Clintons out of it. Everyone who watches the show knows my opinion on whether or not Hillary Clinton is a criminal, and I believe that she did break the law and should have been held accountable for it. But even taking her out of this picture for one moment, this was a crime committed by these Russian officials. We should never have sold, that should never have been approved, that sale of that uranium, because doing this type of thing, and we knew about it, the FBI knew about it in 2009, providing kickbacks, bribes to this nuclear trucking company, that violates the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. That is a crime, and they should have been prosecuted, and they shouldn't have been allowed to conduct business in our country after committing that crime.
Well, 100%. As you've noted, and we've had this conversation before, because of the fact that the uranium is a strategic asset, this sale, leaving aside the trucking firm, the sale of the uranium ore, 20% of our reserves, actually had to be formally approved by this body, this federal commission, on which Hillary Clinton sat, as well as the Attorney General Holder sat. They had to formally chop off on this, take an affirmative action to allow this to go forward. So against the backdrop of everything you're talking about, which is this documented, long-running investigation of corruption and kickbacks and bribes, that sale was allowed to go forward.
Right, and it also debunks
really of corruption.
Right, it also debunks Hillary Clinton's defense. She's defended the money that the Clinton Foundation has accepted from Russia or Russian-linked entities before by saying, no, it wasn't pay to play, it wasn't paying off for favors for her approving this deal. She said because, and her excuse was because she said Russia had nothing, the Russian government had nothing to do with the purchase or the sale of the stores of the uranium, the 20% of uranium. Well, this story debunks that. We see that it's all intricately tied together, and make no mistake, Hillary Clinton knew that all along. Sam, thanks for coming on the show and breaking it down. I appreciate it.